History leaves gaps. Some are accidents of time, others feel deliberate. Before Egypt rose from the Nile's silt, whispers appear in older clay, quieter than myth, heavier than legend. Names erased, teachers unnamed, knowledge arriving complete, as if inherited from a night we no longer remember. This is not about answers, only listening to what survives between broken lines. Before you settle too deeply, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you truly feel at ease with what I'm doing here. Imagine a single lamp burning in an empty room. If it still gives light, who first lit the flame? There is a moment in the deep past where the rhythm of human history changes so abruptly that it feels less like evolution and more like interruption. For tens of thousands of years, human societies leave behind only faint impressions. Stone tools, scattered bones, traces of fire, slow and hesitant gestures toward permanence. Then, within a narrow slice of time, something different appears along the floodplains of southern Mesopotamia. Writing emerges, cities take shape. Law, astronomy, accounting, ritual and architecture arrive not as experiments, but as established systems. The ground beneath history seems to tilt, and the continuity we expect simply vanishes. What unsettles historians is not that Sumer existed, but how it arrived. There is no clear trail of incremental steps leading toward cuneiform writing. There is no long archaeological preface explaining how complex administrative systems slowly assembled themselves. Instead, the earliest layers already show refinement, standardized symbols, mathematical precision, and an awareness of celestial cycles that should have required generations of observation. It feels as though the opening chapters have been torn out, leaving the reader to begin mid-sentence. Mainstream explanations describe this as a rapid cultural flowering, driven by agriculture and surplus. Yet this explanation strains when confronted with the density of knowledge encoded in the earliest tablets. These were not crude marks scratched by trial and error. They were part of a coherent system, shared across cities, disciplined enough to train scribes and durable enough to persist for millennia. Civilizations usually stumble before they walk. Sumer seems to arrive already standing. Even more unsettling is the silence that precedes it. The archaeological record does not show failed prototypes of writing scattered across earlier settlements. There is no obvious lineage of half-formed scripts leading toward cuneiform. Instead, the record suggests a jump, as though a threshold had been crossed suddenly, without leaving footprints behind. In historical terms, this is an anomaly. In human terms, it feels like amnesia. The Sumerians themselves seemed aware of this rupture. Their texts speak often of beginnings that are not truly beginnings. Kingship is said to have descended from heaven, not evolved from tribal leadership. Sacred knowledge is described as something received, not discovered. Even the layout of cities follows cosmological patterns that imply inherited frameworks rather than spontaneous invention. These are not the metaphors of a people improvising their way into civilization. They are the language of custodians. This sense of inheritance carries an undercurrent of loss. The tablets often allude to earlier times, earlier orders, earlier beings whose presence is assumed rather than explained. They do not narrate origins with confidence, but with resignation, as though the true starting point lies beyond reach. What remains is a curated memory, carefully structured, but incomplete. Geology complicates this picture further. The end of the last ice age reshaped coastlines, submerged vast areas, and destabilized climates. Entire regions where early societies might have formed now lie beneath water or silt. If knowledge once circulated in these lost landscapes, its material traces would be gone, leaving only echoes in later cultures that survived the transition. What appears as sudden emergence may in fact be re-emergence. Yet this explanation introduces another problem. If Sumer inherited knowledge from a prior world, why is that inheritance so selective? Why preserve mathematics, astronomy, and kingship myths, but lose the context that explains them? Why remember the rules, but forget the teachers? This pattern suggests not random loss, but filtration, knowledge passed on after compression, simplified to survive catastrophe. Some researchers have noted that early Sumerian myths read less like origin stories and more like after-action reports. Floods are remembered with precision, not symbolism. Social order is framed as restoration, not creation. Even the gods appear less like eternal beings and more like administrators of a system that predates humanity's current arrangement. In this light, myth becomes a storage medium, carrying fragments of real events through symbolic language. The question of timing deepens the mystery. The gap between prehistoric hunter-gatherers and urban Sumerians is not measured in tens of thousands of years, but in mere millennia. This compression challenges the pace at which complex symbolic systems are thought to develop. Language alone takes immense time to standardize. Writing, by contrast, requires deliberate design. Someone must decide what is worth recording, how sounds become signs, how meaning is fixed. These are not accidental processes. What if the apparent leap in civilization reflects not human acceleration, but human recovery? A rebuilding after collapse, guided by memories that were already old when Sumer began to write them down. In such a scenario, Sumer would not be the cradle of civilization, but its archive, the place where fragments were gathered, stabilized, and preserved against further loss. This interpretation does not require fantastical inventions, only a willingness to accept that history may not be linear. Civilizations can rise, fall, and rise again, each time carrying less of what came before. Over time, the origin recedes, until it is mistaken for myth. The silence before Sumer may not mark emptiness, but erasure. What remains undeniable is the tension embedded in the record itself. Sumer stands at the edge of memory, facing backward into a darkness it acknowledges but cannot illuminate. Its achievements feel both triumphant and mournful, like a letter written by survivors who know they are late to the story. The clay tablets endure, not because they explain everything, but because they quietly insist that something existed before them, something now missing. As the dust settles around this first rupture in the historical timeline, one sensation persists, that human history did not begin here, but resumed here. And if that is true, then the story of civilization is not one of steady ascent, but of interrupted inheritance, knowledge surviving just long enough to be passed on, before its origins slip once more into shadow. The names appear without warning, etched into clay with an authority that leaves no room for doubt. They do not introduce themselves as legends, nor do they apologize for their scale. They simply state what was known, that before the flood, before the cities whose ruins we excavate today, there were kings who ruled for lengths of time that defy the proportions of human life. Tens of thousands of years are assigned to single reigns, measured calmly, almost bureaucratically, as if longevity were merely another administrative detail. Modern readers instinctively recoil from these numbers. They are dismissed as symbolic, ceremonial, or exaggerated beyond recognition. Yet this dismissal raises a quieter question. Why exaggerate in this particular direction? Why anchor power not in conquest or wealth, but in duration? If these figures were meant only as metaphors, they are strangely precise, consistent across multiple copies of the king lists, and embedded within a structured chronology that transitions smoothly into historical time once the flood arrives. The Sumerian king list does something unusual. It does not separate myth from history. Instead, it arranges them along a single line, uninterrupted, as though the compilers saw no need to distinguish between a world before catastrophe and the one that followed. Kingship descends, a flood intervenes, and kingship rises again, shorter-lived now, diminished, constrained by new limits. The implication is not confusion, but continuity across rupture. These long reigns are often treated as numerological puzzles, but their narrative role is more revealing than their arithmetic. They establish a tempo for the world before the flood that is fundamentally different from our own. Time moves more slowly there. Change unfolds across ages rather than lifetimes. Authority endures long enough to shape civilizations not through policy, but through presence. This is not the rhythm of mythic storytelling alone. It is the rhythm of a remembered order. Across cultures, similar patterns emerge. Long-lived rulers appear in early genealogies, only to vanish after a great disruption. Lifespans contract, memory fragments. Humanity becomes hurried, compressed into brief generations that struggle to recall what once unfolded over millennia. These parallels are often explained away as shared symbolism, yet symbolism itself must come from somewhere. It must answer a need, reflect an anxiety, or preserve a truth too heavy to state plainly. One possibility is that these reigns encode a memory of beings who were not human in the modern sense, figures whose authority was perceived as external to the fragile cycles of birth and death. Another is more restrained, but no less unsettling, that early societies remembered a time when knowledge was stewarded by lineages that endured far longer than we do now, whether through biology, environment, or cultural structure. Longevity, in this case, would not be supernatural but lost. The texts do not explain how such reigns were possible. They do not describe rituals of life extension or technologies of preservation. They simply record duration as fact, then move on. This silence is important. It suggests that, to the scribes, these lifespans were not mysteries requiring explanation. They were inherited data, part of a record that predated inquiry. After the flood, something breaks. Kings still rule, but their years shrink dramatically. Hundreds replace tens of thousands. Eventually, decades replace centuries. This shift is not gradual. It is abrupt. The world has changed, and the texts know it. The post-flood kings are still important, still semi-divine at times, but they no longer exist on the same temporal plane as their predecessors. They govern history, not eternity. This compression of time mirrors a compression of memory. The farther the lists move from the flood, the more detailed they become. Names acquire stories, reigns acquire conflicts. Human drama fills the space once occupied by sheer duration. It is as if the earlier world was too vast to narrate, its scale flattening story into numbers, while the later world grows small enough to describe. Skeptics argue that the long reigns are simply devices to magnify antiquity, to push origins deeper into the past. Yet this explanation falters when we consider how carefully the Sumerians preserved records. These were not casual myth-makers. They were obsessive archivists, tracking grain, labour and celestial events with precision. To assume that they would casually fabricate the backbone of their chronology requires believing that they suddenly abandoned their usual discipline when dealing with the most important question of all, where they came from. Another interpretation suggests that the reigns represent dynasties rather than individuals, their years accumulating across generations. But this theory collapses under the specificity of the names. Each reign is attributed to a single ruler, not a house or lineage. The structure resists simplification. What remains, then, is discomfort. The lists force us to confront the possibility that the ancient world remembered something we have chosen to forget. Not necessarily gods walking openly among humans, but a different scale of existence, one in which authority, memory, and time itself behave differently. The flood in this reading is not just a natural disaster, but a boundary between modes of being. If the antediluvian kings were guardians of a previous order, their disappearance marks more than political change. It marks a narrowing of the human horizon. Knowledge that required centuries to cultivate would have been impossible to sustain afterward. Systems that depended on continuity would collapse into fragments. What survived would need to be simplified, encoded, and mythologized to pass through the bottleneck. By the time Sumer begins to write in earnest, it may already be too late to explain what was lost. All that remains are lists, names, numbers, reigns, standing like grave markers for an age too large to reconstruct. They do not argue for belief. They do not ask to be trusted. They merely persist, insisting that the past was once stranger, longer, and more stable than the present allows. As we move forward from these names, the question lingers in the background, unresolved and unspoken. If the rulers before the flood lived in a different relationship with time, what else did they know that required such patience to hold? And if that knowledge vanished with them, what traces might still be hidden in the records they left behind, waiting for us to learn how to read them again? They are mentioned almost in passing, yet their presence lingers like a pressure beneath the text. Not kings, not gods in the theatrical sense, but figures described as intermediaries, beings who arrive, instruct, and withdraw. In Sumerian records they are called Apkallu. Later traditions would remember them differently, translating their role into other languages and symbols, but the function remains remarkably stable. They are bringers of order, carriers of instruction, and custodians of a knowledge that does not originate with humanity itself. The earliest descriptions are restrained. The Apkallu are not portrayed as conquerors or saviors. They do not dominate the world, they organize it. They teach writing, ritual, measurement, agriculture, and the laws that bind communities together. Civilization does not invent these things alone. It receives them. The texts speak as if this were self-evident, requiring no elaboration. The surprise is not that instruction occurred, but that it later ceased. What makes these figures difficult to categorize is their ambiguous status. They are not mortal, yet they are not entirely divine. They belong to an older layer of reality, one that overlaps with the human world but does not fully merge with it. They appear at moments of transition, when society is fragile and unformed, and disappear once stability is achieved. This pattern suggests a role closer to stewardship than rulership. Later iconography complicates the picture. The Apkallu are sometimes depicted with animal attributes, wings, scales, or fish-like garments, imagery that modern readers quickly label as symbolic. Yet symbolism does not erase function. These hybrid forms may encode qualities rather than appearances, mobility between realms, adaptability, protection. The visual language points toward difference, not monstrosity. The Apkallu are marked as other, but not hostile. What is striking is how little narrative surrounds them. They are not the subjects of epic struggle or moral drama. They do not argue, rebel, or fall in love. They teach, then recede. This absence of storytelling suggests that the scribes were not inventing characters for entertainment. They were preserving roles within a remembered system, even if the system itself had already faded. Across cultures, echoes of this pattern appear. Watchers, sages, civilizing heroes, figures who arrive from elsewhere bearing knowledge too advanced for the societies they encounter. Often, these figures are later reinterpreted as gods or demons, depending on theological needs. Yet in their earliest forms, they occupy a narrow and specific function. They instruct humanity in how to live within a structured world. One explanation frames the Apkallu as mythological personifications of accumulated wisdom. Another suggests they represent priestly castes, whose origins were deliberately obscured to elevate authority. Both explanations account for some features, but neither fully addresses the consistency with which these figures are described as external to humanity. The texts do not claim that humans became Apkallu through learning. The direction of transmission is always one way. The timing of their withdrawal is as important as their arrival. In later traditions, the Apkallu are said to be removed or punished after a catastrophic event. Knowledge remains, but the teachers are gone. Humanity is left with instructions but without oversight. This transition aligns with the broader shift observed after the flood narratives. A world that once operated under extended continuity becomes compressed, fragile, and prone to forgetting. If these accounts preserve a historical memory, however distorted, they point toward a phase of civilization in which knowledge was curated rather than discovered. Learning was not an open-ended process, but a transfer. Once that transfer was complete or interrupted, the source disappeared. What followed was interpretation, repetition, and gradual decay. This raises a subtle but unsettling possibility. If the Apkallu were remembered because they introduced systems too complex to have emerged spontaneously, then their absence marks the moment humanity was left to maintain structures it did not fully understand. Ritual replaces explanation. Tradition substitutes for comprehension. Over time, function is preserved while meaning erodes. The silence of the texts regarding the origin of the Apkallu may be intentional. Origins are dangerous to preserve when they undermine autonomy. To remember that civilization was taught is to accept dependency. To forget the teachers is to claim ownership. In this sense, myth becomes a compromise. It acknowledges inheritance without naming the source too clearly. Some scholars have noted that the Apkallu are associated with deep time and primordial waters, spaces beyond ordinary human access. These associations may reflect environmental memories, coastal worlds lost to rising seas, centers of learning erased by geological change. If so, the teachers did not vanish mysteriously. They were simply unreachable. Distance over generations became divinity. Yet even this grounded explanation does not fully dissolve the unease. The Apkallu are remembered not just as elders, but as correctors. They bring order where there was none. They impose structure that aligns human society with cosmic patterns. This implies a standard external to humanity, a template against which civilization is measured. By the time Sumer's own historical kings rule, the Apkallu are no longer present. Their role has been absorbed into institutions, rituals, and texts. The memory of instruction survives, but the instructors themselves become abstractions. What was once a relationship becomes a doctrine. This transformation mirrors the broader trajectory of ancient knowledge. Systems persist long after their creators are gone. Calendars continue without those who first observed the sky. Laws endure without those who defined justice. Humanity inherits tools whose origins are obscured, using them with confidence but without context. The Apkallu stand at the edge of this inheritance. They are the last figures remembered before teaching becomes tradition, and guidance becomes habit. Their quiet disappearance marks the moment civilization begins to drift, relying on repetition rather than renewal. As their outlines fade into later mythologies, one detail remains consistent: they do not return. Whatever threshold separated their world from ours closes permanently. Humanity is left alone with its fragments, tasked with maintaining a system it did not design. And as these fragments are carried forward, inscribed into clay and memory, another question begins to take shape, not voiced directly, but implied in the very act of preservation. If knowledge once arrived from outside the human story, and if its bearers withdrew after a great rupture, then the records that remain may not be celebrating our origins at all. They may be quietly marking the point at which guidance ended, and responsibility, heavy and unresolved, began. When the tablets are examined closely, a quiet contradiction begins to surface. The people who pressed these symbols into wet clay lived without telescopes, without precision instruments, without the technologies that modern science treats as prerequisites for serious astronomical observation. And yet, embedded within their records is a working knowledge of the sky that feels measured rather than imagined, disciplined rather than poetic. The Sumerians did not look upward only for omens. They tracked motion. They organized time according to repeating celestial cycles, aligning ritual, agriculture, and kingship with patterns that required long-term consistency to recognize. This was not casual stargazing. It was systematic observation carried out over spans of time longer than a single lifetime. What makes this unsettling is not that ancient people studied the sky, but the level of abstraction they achieved. The sexagesimal system, the base 60 mathematics that still governs how we divide hours, minutes, and degrees, was already in use. This numerical framework is not intuitive. It is optimized for divisibility, allowing complex fractions to be handled cleanly. Such a system suggests planning, not improvisation. Even more striking is the way astronomical knowledge appears fully integrated into social order. Calendars were not local experiments, they were standardized across regions. Festivals corresponded to celestial events with remarkable regularity. Errors would have disrupted agriculture, ritual, and authority. Yet the system held, implying a long period of calibration before it was set into writing. The question that emerges is subtle but persistent. Who had the time to make these observations? To identify long planetary cycles, to distinguish irregular motion from periodic return, requires records that span generations. It requires patience and institutional memory. Yet Sumerian civilization, as archaeology presents it, arrives abruptly. There is little evidence of the extended observational phase such knowledge demands. One explanation suggests that this phase occurred, but its material traces were lost. Floodplains erase their own histories efficiently. Settlements built of mud brick dissolve back into earth. If early observatories existed in coastal or riverine regions now submerged or buried, their absence would be unsurprising. Knowledge, however, could travel more easily than structures. Another possibility is more unsettling, that the observational work was not done by the society that inherited it, that the sky had already been mapped, the cycles already known, before Sumer became the keeper of the records. In this scenario, the scribes are not pioneers, but archivists, preserving a framework that arrived intact. This interpretation finds quiet support in the tone of the texts themselves. Astronomical lists do not explain how knowledge was obtained. They do not describe discovery. They present information as given. The movement of planets is recorded with the same neutrality as grain tallies or labor assignments. There is no celebration of insight, only continuity. The stars in these records are not distant mysteries. They are components of a system that already exists. Their movements correspond to divine order, but the divinity feels procedural rather than emotional. The heavens operate according to rules, and those rules are stable enough to be trusted. This sense of inherited structure extends into geometry and measurement. Land was divided with precision. Temples were oriented according to cardinal directions. Spatial order mirrored cosmic order. Such alignment requires shared standards, not local intuition. It implies that the principles governing space and time were already codified. What is often overlooked is how fragile such systems are. Astronomical knowledge degrades quickly without maintenance. Calendars drift. Observations lose accuracy. For the Sumerian system to function as smoothly as it did, it must have been actively preserved, corrected, and taught. Yet there is little evidence of an extended educational apparatus explaining these principles from first principles. Instead, instruction appears ritualized. Knowledge is transmitted through repetition, not derivation. Apprentices learn what to do, not why it works. This is efficient, but it also suggests distance from original understanding. The system remains functional, even as comprehension fades. In later periods, errors begin to accumulate. Adjustments are made, omens replace measurements, astrology slowly overtakes astronomy. This shift is revealing. It suggests that the earlier clarity was difficult to sustain once the original context was gone. Precision gives way to interpretation. Calculation yields to symbolism. If this pattern reflects a loss rather than a development, then Sumer stands at an inflection point. It preserves a high watermark of technical knowledge just before it begins to fragment. The tablets become a reservoir, holding back decay for as long as clay can endure. The idea that ancient people could independently develop such systems is not impossible. Human intelligence has always been capable of abstraction. But capability does not guarantee opportunity. The time required to generate this knowledge must exist somewhere in the timeline. If it is not visible before Sumer, then it must belong to a chapter we have not recovered. This does not require imagining advanced machines or hidden empires. It requires only acknowledging that observation, patience, and continuity are resources, and that they may once have been available under conditions no longer accessible to us. A stable climate, a slower rhythm of life, longer spans of authority, memory that did not reset every generation. Seen this way, Sumerian astronomy reads less like a beginning and more like a handover. A moment when accumulated knowledge is compressed into durable form, safeguarded against instability. Writing becomes a technology of survival, not innovation. The stars themselves become witnesses. They do not change. They continue their cycles, indifferent to who observes them. What changes is the observer's relationship to time. The Sumerians look upward with confidence, not wonder. They trust the sky because it has already proven itself reliable. As later cultures inherit fragments of this system, the confidence erodes. The sky becomes mysterious again. Knowledge becomes speculative. What was once measured becomes interpreted. This transition marks not an ascent, but a retreat, from certainty into symbolism. Within this retreat, a quiet implication remains. If early civilization possessed a clearer map of the heavens than those who followed, then progress may not be the correct metaphor for history. What appears as advancement may instead be adaptation to loss. The tablets do not mourn this loss explicitly. They do not accuse. They simply record, preserving alignment between earth and sky for as long as possible. In doing so, they leave behind a question not asked directly, but written into every calculation and calendar mark. If the order of the heavens was once known well enough to structure an entire civilization, and if that knowledge later faded into myth and omen, then the story of humanity may not be one of discovery reaching upward, but of memory slowly falling away while the stars continue to move, unchanged, above a world that no longer remembers how it first learned to watch them. Memory, when pressed hard enough, does not disappear. It distorts. It folds itself into symbols, into stories told softly so they can survive being told at all. In the Sumerian world, one memory rises above all others, repeated with a gravity that feels less like myth-making and more like remembrance. A great flood. Not merely rain, but a boundary in time, a dividing line between what was and what could no longer be sustained. The flood narratives are often treated as allegory, a moral tale about hubris or divine judgment. Yet the texture of these accounts resists pure symbolism. They are specific where myths are usually vague. They speak of duration, of construction, of survival strategies. They name materials. They count days. They describe silence after devastation. These are not the gestures of imagination wandering freely. They are the fingerprints of experience being carefully reassembled. What makes the Sumerian flood memory distinctive is not that it exists, but how it functions within their worldview. The flood is not an origin story, it is a reset. Civilization does not begin after the waters recede, it resumes. Kingship returns, cities are rebuilt, knowledge continues, altered but recognizable. The flood interrupts continuity without erasing it completely. This framing suggests that the disaster was not total annihilation, but selective erasure. Something survived. Something was carried through the collapse, even if only in fragments. The emphasis is not on divine wrath, but on preservation under extreme constraint. Survival becomes an act of curation. Geological evidence lends a muted resonance to this memory. At the end of the last ice age, melting glaciers raised sea levels dramatically. Coastal plains vanished. River systems shifted. Regions that could have supported early, stable societies were submerged or destabilized. For communities living near water, such changes would not appear gradual. They would arrive as catastrophe, rewriting landscapes within human memory. In such conditions, survival would favor compression. Knowledge too complex to memorize would be lost. Practices too resource-intensive would fail. What endured would be what could be carried, repeated, and adapted quickly. Writing, once established, would become essential, not as innovation, but as insurance against forgetting. The Sumerian flood story carries this logic within it. The survivor does not rebuild civilization from intuition. He preserves what already exists. Measurements, rituals, and lineages are protected, not reinvented. The goal is continuity across rupture, not reinvention. This may explain the peculiar tone of early post-flood culture. There is little sense of experimentation. Systems appear fixed, conservative, reverent toward precedent. Change is viewed with suspicion. Stability becomes sacred. In a world that has already ended once, preservation outweighs curiosity. The memory of the flood also reconfigures authority. Before the catastrophe, reigns last unimaginably long. Afterward, time contracts. Power becomes transient. Human leaders inherit responsibility without the extended temporal horizon that once supported it. Governance becomes urgent, compressed into shorter spans, more vulnerable to error. Within this compression, myths serve as containers for what cannot be practiced anymore. Flood narratives preserve ecological knowledge, survival strategies, and warnings encoded in story rather than instruction. They function as slow alarms, reminding later generations that stability is conditional. The persistence of similar flood memories across distant cultures has often been cited as coincidence or shared symbolism. Yet when examined through the lens of environmental upheaval, these parallels take on a different weight. Rising waters do not respect borders. Climate disruption leaves traces wherever humans are settled. Memory, once fragmented, travels in whatever form it can. What distinguishes the Sumerian account is its integration into administrative history. The flood is not a separate mythic event. It is embedded within king lists and civic records. It marks a chronological pivot, treated with the same seriousness as political transitions. This placement suggests that, for the scribes, the flood was not a story outside history, but history itself. The act of writing becomes central here. Clay tablets are heavy, fragile, and permanent. Choosing to record something in this medium signals importance. The flood earns this status not because it teaches a lesson, but because it explains a condition. It accounts for why the world is smaller, faster, and more fragile than it once was. In this light, the flood is less about destruction and more about narrowing. The range of human possibility contracts. Long-term projects become impossible. Knowledge that requires centuries to mature no longer fits within the new temporal economy. Civilization adapts by simplifying, ritualizing, and mythologizing what it can no longer fully sustain. This adaptation carries a quiet grief. The texts do not lament openly, but they gesture toward loss through repetition. The flood is remembered again and again, as if retelling might stabilize it, prevent it from happening again. Memory becomes a form of resistance against recurrence. As generations pass, the catastrophe recedes into abstraction. Gods replace water, judgment replaces geology. The mechanism fades, but the warning remains. Something once happened that nearly erased everything. Something could happen again. Sumer's role, then, may not have been to invent civilization, but to rescue it from oblivion, to gather what could be saved after the waters withdrew and anchor it in durable form. Writing becomes an arc of sorts, carrying compressed knowledge through uncertain futures. Seen this way, the sudden sophistication of Sumerian culture takes on a different meaning. It is not the exuberance of a beginning, but the urgency of a restart. Systems are established quickly because there is no time to rediscover them slowly. Memory must be stabilized before it dissolves further. The flood in this interpretation is not merely an ancient disaster. It is the first acknowledged reset, a reminder that human history is not guaranteed continuity. Each civilization exists at the mercy of forces larger than its plans. As the clay dries around these memories, a deeper implication settles beneath the narrative. If one reset has already occurred, and if knowledge survived only through compression and chance, then the world we inhabit may not be the first version of itself. It may be what remains after forgetting did its work. The waters recede, cities rise again, names are written. Yet beneath every record lies the awareness that stability is temporary, and that history, once broken, never fully returns to its original shape. What Sumer preserves is not certainty, but a warning carried forward in quiet persistence, an acknowledgement that civilization has already ended once, and that its survival depends on remembering how close it came to silence. When the Sumerian record is placed beside other ancient memories, something unsettling begins to emerge. The flood, the long-lived rulers, the teachers who arrive and withdraw. These are not isolated motifs. They recur across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, appearing in different languages but carrying the same structural weight. It is not the sameness of detail that matters, but the sameness of sequence. In Egypt, civilization also appears with an unexpected sense of readiness. Monumental architecture, ritualized kingship, and cosmological alignment emerge early, already disciplined. Egyptian tradition speaks of a time before the dynasties, an era ruled by divine or semi-divine beings who established order. Like the Sumerian accounts, this earlier age is not described in full. It is acknowledged, then quietly sealed off. Hebrew tradition carries the memory differently, narrowing it into genealogy and covenant. Lifespans stretch unnaturally long in the earliest generations, then collapse after a catastrophic flood. Knowledge survives through chosen lines rather than institutions. The pattern remains: extended continuity before disruption, compression afterward. In the Indian subcontinent, time itself is structured as repetition. Ages rise and fall in cycles of creation and destruction, each diminishing in duration and moral coherence. Earlier ages are longer, purer, closer to cosmic order. Later ages are shorter, fragmented, burdened by forgetting. Here memory expands into cosmology, but the direction is the same, from fullness toward decay. These traditions are often dismissed as mythological coincidence, yet coincidence struggles to explain the shared architecture beneath the stories. Each culture remembers an early phase marked by stability, longevity, and guidance, followed by a rupture that permanently alters the human condition. Civilization does not progress upward from chaos. It descends from a prior equilibrium. What changes most noticeably after these ruptures is not technology, but confidence. Early traditions speak with certainty about cosmic order. Later ones debate, interpret, and argue. Law replaces instruction. Faith replaces familiarity. The universe becomes something to explain, rather than something already known. This shift suggests that the shared memory is not of invention, but of loss. The earliest layers preserve a sense that something essential was once available and is now inaccessible. Each culture encodes this loss according to its own worldview, but the emotional residue is the same: reverence mixed with distance. Geography offers one possible thread connecting these memories. Many early societies developed along coastlines and river systems vulnerable to climate instability. Rising waters would not only erase settlements, but sever lines of communication between knowledge centres. Isolation accelerates divergence. Shared memory fragments into localized traditions. In such a scenario, a common prehistory could splinter rapidly. What one culture preserves as a list of kings, another reshapes into divine genealogies, and another expands into cosmic cycles. The core experience remains, but its expression adapts to survival needs. Language itself contributes to this distortion. As meanings shift, technical knowledge becomes symbolic. Practical instructions become sacred stories. Over time, function is retained through ritual long after its original rationale is forgotten. Memory survives, but it changes shape. What is striking is how rarely these traditions portray the rupture as a clean ending. The flood does not eliminate humanity, it reshapes it. The divine age does not vanish completely, it recedes. The previous world becomes unreachable, not destroyed. This nuance suggests continuity strained, not severed. Modern historiography often prefers singular origins. It seeks a first civilization, a definitive beginning. Yet the ancient record resists this simplicity. It gestures toward layers, toward repeated resets, toward a humanity that has rebuilt itself more than once. Each rebuild carries less of what came before. If this is true, then Sumer's position in history changes subtly but profoundly. It becomes not the cradle of civilization, but the earliest visible shoreline after a flood of forgetting. The first place where fragments of a much older world become legible again. This perspective also reframes the similarities between cultures not as borrowing or diffusion, but as inheritance under constraint. When survivors rebuild in isolation, they do not create freely, they conserve. They encode memory in forms that can survive scarcity and instability. Myth, ritual, and monument become storage devices. The cost of this storage is opacity. Later generations inherit the form without the context. Meaning becomes layered, ambiguous. Scholars debate symbolism while missing function. What was once practical knowledge dissolves into allegory. Across cultures, the earliest remembered figures are not innovators, but restorers. They bring back law, order, measurement, and alignment. Their task is not to invent a world, but to stabilize one that has already slipped once. This role aligns with the Apkallu, the Watchers, the Divine Kings, figures who appear briefly then vanish once structure holds. Their disappearance is crucial. It marks the point at which humanity must maintain continuity alone. The world becomes fragile, dependent on memory rather than guidance. Institutions replace mentors. Texts replace presence. As these institutions age, they harden. Orthodoxy emerges. Questioning becomes dangerous because the original understanding is no longer accessible. To probe too deeply risks exposing ignorance. Better to preserve form than risk collapse. This may explain why later power structures become invested in controlling historical narrative. If knowledge once came from elsewhere, admitting that fact destabilizes authority. It is safer to present civilization as self-generated, even if the record quietly disagrees. The convergence of ancient memories, then, is not proof of a single lost empire or unified culture. It is evidence of a shared condition, humanity living in the aftermath of a reset, reconstructing meaning from fragments while slowly forgetting that reconstruction itself is not the beginning. As these traditions diverge, they all point backward toward a horizon they cannot cross, a time remembered not for its achievements, but for its stability. A world where guidance existed, where time moved differently, where continuity was possible. The fact that so many cultures remember this horizon, each in their own language, suggests that the rupture was global in effect, even if local in manifestation. The floodwaters rise differently in each valley, but the sense of loss is shared. Standing within Sumer's record, we are not witnessing the dawn of civilization. We are listening to echoes converging after a long silence. Each echo carries a piece of the same absence, reshaped by distance and survival. And as these echoes align across continents, They quietly undermine the idea that history moves forward in a straight line. Instead, they suggest a rhythm of remembering and forgetting, of building atop ruins whose origins fade faster than their stones. What remains unresolved is not whether these memories are myth or history, but why they persist so stubbornly across human cultures. Perhaps they endure because they are not merely stories about the past. Perhaps they are warnings, encoded reminders that what we call civilization has already been interrupted once, and that continuity, when lost, never returns whole again. There is a subtle tension that emerges when Egypt enters the narrative, a tension not of rivalry but of recognition. It is as if another civilization steps onto the stage already aware that something came before, something that must be honoured rather than questioned. Egypt does not announce itself as a beginning. It behaves as a continuation, carefully measured, deliberately restrained. Along the Nile, order appears almost immediately. Agricultural cycles align cleanly with the river's flooding. Sacred architecture follows strict orientation to the cardinal directions. Kingship is fused with cosmic responsibility from the start. These are not the traits of a society experimenting its way toward coherence. They are the behaviours of a culture stepping into a role it believes already exists. Egyptian tradition itself gestures toward this inheritance. Before the first dynasties, there is an earlier age, an era ruled by gods or divine ancestors who establish Maat, the principle of balance that underlies all existence. This age is not narrated in detail. It is referenced, acknowledged, then left untouched. The implication is not ignorance, but distance. The past is known to be deeper than memory can safely reach. Human kings, when they appear, do not claim to invent order. They claim to embody it. The pharaoh is not a lawgiver in the Sumerian sense, nor an innovator. He is a stabilizer, a living hinge between heaven and earth. His authority depends on alignment with a cosmic system that predates him and will outlast him. This posture mirrors Sumer in a quiet way. Both cultures treat civilization as something received rather than discovered. Both frame knowledge as sacred, fixed, and dangerous to alter. Change is permitted only within narrow corridors. Stability is not a preference, it is a moral obligation. Yet Egypt's method of preservation differs sharply. Where Sumer presses memory into clay, Egypt carves it into stone. One culture fears forgetting, the other fears collapse. Together, they reveal two strategies for surviving after a rupture. Record everything, or monumentalize essentials. Neither strategy assumes the luxury of rediscovery. The absence of developmental clutter in early Egypt is telling. There are no tentative experiments in kingship, no chaotic transitions from village to state preserved in the record. The system appears complete. This completeness has often been romanticized, but it may also signal compression, knowledge transferred under pressure without time for gradual adaptation. If Egypt did not invent its cosmology from scratch, then where did it come from? Direct borrowing from Sumer explains only surface similarities. The deeper resonance lies in shared assumptions, that order exists independently of humanity, that knowledge once arrived fully formed, and that maintaining it is more important than understanding its origin. This suggests a common inheritance, fragmented and redistributed after a major disruption. As communities rebuilt in isolation, they preserved what they could. Sumer retained procedural memory, lists, numbers, calculations. Egypt preserved symbolic coherence, alignment, ritual, permanence. Each held part of a larger system neither fully understood alone. Egypt's geographical isolation may have amplified this conservatism. Protected by deserts, buffered from constant upheaval, the civilization could afford to freeze its worldview. Innovation became unnecessary, even dangerous. The goal was not progress, but endurance. Time was not something to outrun, but something to stabilize. The gods of Egypt reflect this ethos. They are not volatile personalities wrestling with fate. They are principles embodied: order, continuity, regeneration. Even chaos is formalized, ritualized, given a place so it can be contained. Divinity here is managerial, not dramatic. It maintains the system rather than disrupting it. Architecture makes this philosophy visible. Pyramids are not expressions of individual ambition. They are instruments of alignment, binding king, land, and stars into a single geometry. Such precision implies adherence to a blueprint, not spontaneous inspiration. Blueprints by definition precede construction. By the time Egypt's monuments rise, the architects no longer explain why the blueprint exists, they follow it. Ritual replaces rationale. Performance replaces inquiry. Knowledge survives, but its origin retreats into sanctified silence. This silence may be intentional. Questioning origins risks destabilizing authority. If order was taught once, then it could be taught again, or withdrawn. To rule securely, one must present order as eternal, not inherited. The safest history is one that does not look too far back. Over centuries, Egypt's system remains remarkably stable. Dynasties change, names fade, but the core structure endures. This stability has often been praised as genius. It may also be read as constraint, the careful maintenance of a legacy too fragile to reimagine. Seen this way, Egypt's sudden maturity becomes less miraculous and more somber. It is the maturity of responsibility, not youth. A civilization stepping into guardianship, aware that what it protects cannot be easily replaced. When Egypt and Sumer are viewed side by side, the resemblance is not in their art or language, but in their restraint. Both cultures know that civilization has already failed once. Both behave as if another failure would be final. Sumer whispers this knowledge through lists and laments. Egypt encodes it in stone and silence. Together, they form a fractured memory of a prior order, one that balanced calculation and meaning, record and ritual. Neither culture fully remembers that order. They preserve outputs without context, structures without explanations. As later civilizations inherit only fragments of these fragments, the original coherence dissolves further, leaving myth, symbol, and speculation in its place. Egypt's role in this story, then, is not to eclipse Sumer, nor to stand as an independent miracle. It is to echo the same unresolved inheritance through a different strategy of survival. Where Sumer fears forgetting, Egypt fears deviation. Both fears point to the same buried understanding, that civilization is not guaranteed, that it has already been interrupted once, and that what remains is fragile. As Egypt's monuments cast long shadows across the desert, they do more than honor kings or gods. They mark a decision, to preserve rather than explore, to stabilize rather than question, and beneath that decision lies an unspoken recognition that the true beginning lies further back than memory allows, and that some origins, once lost, are safer left unexamined than fully recalled. As time passes and direct understanding thins, knowledge does not vanish evenly. It survives unevenly, settling into places where repetition can protect it from erosion. In the worlds of Sumer and Egypt, this survival takes on a specific shape. Knowledge retreats from explanation and takes refuge in form, symbols, architecture, gestures, and sequences that can be repeated without being fully understood. This transformation marks a subtle but decisive shift. In earlier phases, knowledge appears procedural. It is applied, measured, and used. In later phases, it becomes representational. It is shown rather than explained, enacted rather than taught. Meaning is no longer transmitted through inquiry, but through preservation. Symbols become the primary vessels of this transition. A symbol does not require comprehension to endure. It requires only fidelity. As long as it is copied correctly, it remains intact, even if its internal logic is forgotten. This makes symbols ideal containers for knowledge passing through periods of instability. In Sumer, the signs that once denoted practical operations begin to carry layered meanings. A mark that records grain can also gesture toward abundance, divine favor, or cosmic order. Over time, these layers multiply. The symbol remains stable, but interpretation grows fluid. What was once precise becomes suggestive. Egypt intensifies this process. Hieroglyphs are not merely phonetic tools, they are images that hold conceptual weight. A single sign can operate simultaneously as sound, idea, and sacred presence. This redundancy is not aesthetic excess, it is insurance. If one layer is lost, another may still survive. Architecture extends this logic into space. Buildings become texts that do not require literacy. Proportion, alignment, and repetition encode information that cannot be erased easily. A temple aligned to celestial events preserves astronomical knowledge without needing calculation. A processional path preserves sequence without explanation. Ritual binds these elements together. It is knowledge enacted through the body rather than articulated through language. Movements are repeated exactly. Words are spoken in forms already archaic to their speakers. The efficacy of ritual depends not on understanding, but on accuracy. This emphasis on accuracy over comprehension signals an underlying condition. The system being preserved is no longer fully grasped by its custodians. They know that deviation matters, but they no longer know why. The reason has slipped beyond reach, leaving only the rule. Such a condition breeds conservatism. Innovation becomes risky. Questioning becomes dangerous. When consequences are remembered but mechanisms are forgotten, the safest path is repetition. Over time, repetition hardens into orthodoxy. This is how encoded knowledge acquires sacred status. Sacredness does not originate from mystery alone, but from fragility. When meaning is at risk of being lost, it must be protected. Restriction of access becomes a form of preservation. Priestly classes emerge not merely as power brokers, but as guardians of form. Their authority rests on their ability to perform correctly, to remember sequences, to maintain continuity. Whether they understand the origins of what they guard becomes secondary. Kings align themselves with these forms to legitimize rule. Architecture, ritual, and symbol merge into a single language of authority. Order is presented as eternal, unchanging, and sanctioned by forces beyond human negotiation. This presentation masks the fact that the order itself is inherited. As centuries pass, the distance between form and origin widens. Symbols begin to float free from their initial anchors. Interpretation multiplies. Competing meanings emerge. What was once a stabilizing container becomes a contested space. Astrology illustrates this transition clearly. Early observation of celestial cycles gives way to symbolic reading. The sky remains central, but its movements are no longer measured for calibration alone. They are interpreted for meaning. Precision yields to significance. This shift is often framed as degeneration, but is more accurately adaptation. When precise systems can no longer be maintained, symbolic ones offer continuity. They preserve orientation even as accuracy fades. Civilization remains coherent, though increasingly abstract. Yet abstraction carries risk. Symbols can be repurposed. Rituals can be detached from function. Architecture can become venerated rather than understood. When this happens, the system appears strong but becomes brittle. It resists change, yet cannot respond intelligently to new conditions. The creators of early symbolic systems may have anticipated this risk. Their obsession with permanence suggests awareness of drift. Stone is chosen over wood. Repetition is favored over variation. Symmetry is enforced. These choices slow reinterpretation, but they cannot prevent it entirely. Later cultures inherit these forms without the caution that shaped them. Symbols become raw material for theology, philosophy, and political ideology. Each reinterpretation moves further from the original compression that preserved the knowledge in the first place. For modern observers, this creates a paradox. The past appears rich with symbols, yet opaque in meaning. We study forms without frameworks. We admire precision without knowing its purpose. The archive survives, but the key is missing. If early civilizations encoded knowledge to survive collapse, then misunderstanding by future generations was not a failure of design. It was an accepted cost. Better that knowledge endure imperfectly than disappear entirely. This reframes ancient symbols as emergency measures rather than puzzles. They were not meant to be decoded easily. They were meant to resist erasure. Their creators may have known that future societies would lack the context needed to fully recover what was sealed within them. In this light, ritual precision takes on a new meaning. Exact repetition is not superstition, it is maintenance. When systems are fragile and origins are forgotten, fidelity becomes the highest value. Over time, however, this fidelity can be exploited. Control over symbols becomes control over meaning. Authority consolidates around those who claim exclusive access to encoded knowledge. Preservation shades into power. This dual legacy, protection and control, defines the symbolic inheritance of early civilizations. The same mechanisms that safeguarded knowledge also made it vulnerable to manipulation. Standing among these symbols today, we're not encountering deliberate riddles designed for future enlightenment. We are encountering compressed memories, sealed during a crisis of continuity. They were meant to endure loss, not overcome it. Each symbol, each ritual, each aligned structure carries a quiet acknowledgement that something once understood had to be preserved without explanation, that civilization had already passed through a narrowing, and that survival required sacrificing clarity. As these forms accumulate across cultures and centuries, they generate an illusion of timeless wisdom. Yet beneath that illusion lies a more fragile truth. What we inherit is not the fullness of ancient knowledge, but what could be carried through disruption. The symbols endure, the structures stand, the rituals continue. And within them remains a faint pressure from an earlier world, one that encoded its understanding not to enlighten the future, but to survive long enough to reach it at all. By the time modern archaeology begins to assemble its picture of the ancient world, a subtle tension is already in place. On one side stands the official narrative. Civilization emerges gradually, driven by agriculture, surplus, and social complexity. On the other side lie the artifacts themselves, quietly refusing to align perfectly with that expectation. Between these two positions stretches a silence, one that is rarely discussed openly, yet shapes how evidence is interpreted. This silence does not take the form of missing data alone. It appears in how anomalies are categorized, how certain questions are postponed indefinitely, how gaps are smoothed over with language that sounds conclusive while remaining vague. When early Sumerian tablets present advanced systems without clear developmental precursors, the response is often to widen the definition of development, rather than narrow the mystery. Complexity is assumed to have existed somewhere, sometime, even if its traces are absent. Such assumptions are not malicious, they are structural. Academic disciplines depend on continuity. A sudden break in the human story is difficult to accommodate, not because it is impossible, but because it destabilizes the frameworks used to interpret everything else. To accept a true rupture, a civilizational reset, would require re-examining timelines, methodologies, and inherited conclusions. As a result, anomalies are often isolated rather than integrated. A tablet with unexpected mathematical precision becomes an outlier. An architectural alignment too accurate for its era becomes a coincidence. Each irregularity is explained locally, never allowed to accumulate into a larger pattern. The effect is subtle but powerful. Questions are answered individually, preventing them from converging. This approach creates the impression of resolution without closure. Every puzzle has an explanation, but the overall picture remains uneasy. The official narrative holds together, yet only by distributing discomfort across many small compartments. What is avoided is not evidence, but implication. Archaeology is not blind to absence. It acknowledges that much has been lost. Organic materials decay, settlements erode, floodplains erase their own histories. Yet when loss becomes the default explanation, it begins to function as a shield. What cannot be found is assumed to have existed, even if its absence aligns too neatly with a missing chapter. The reluctance to engage deeply with civilizational discontinuity may stem from a deeper anxiety. If history has reset before, then progress is not guaranteed. If advanced systems once existed and collapsed, then modern civilization is not the culmination of a linear ascent, but another phase within a fragile cycle. This is not a comforting conclusion. Institutions tend to favor narratives that reinforce stability. A gradual, cumulative rise of knowledge supports confidence in expertise, authority, and prediction. A history marked by abrupt loss and recovery introduces uncertainty about permanence, about resilience, about the future. Within this context, myth becomes an inconvenience. Flood stories, long-lived rulers, civilizing teachers, all are acknowledged, then carefully bracketed away from serious historical consideration. They are treated as psychological artifacts rather than potential memory carriers. Their persistence across cultures is noted, but rarely pursued to its logical depth. Yet the ancient scribes themselves did not draw such strict boundaries. For them, myth, record, and ritual existed along a continuum. A king list could include reigns spanning tens of thousands of years without apology. A flood could be both cosmic and historical. Meaning was layered, not compartmentalized. Modern interpretation, by contrast, prefers clean separations. History must be factual, myth symbolic, ritual performative. These distinctions help organize study, but they may also obscure how ancient people encoded experience. What we call myth may not have been intended as fiction, but as compressed remembrance. The challenge is that compressed remembrance does not behave like modern evidence. It resists direct verification. It survives in patterns rather than proofs. To engage with it seriously requires a willingness to tolerate ambiguity without immediately resolving it. This tolerance is difficult to sustain within systems that reward definitive answers. As a result, scholars often gravitate toward explanations that preserve continuity, even when continuity must be inferred rather than demonstrated. The possibility of a forgotten high watermark of civilization becomes academically uncomfortable. This discomfort surfaces in how certain topics are framed. Discussions of lost knowledge are redirected toward technological primitivism. Speculation about earlier advanced societies is dismissed as fringe, regardless of whether the evidence in question is real or not. The boundary between responsible skepticism and reflexive dismissal becomes blurred. What is rarely asked is why the ancient world itself speaks so insistently of loss. Why so many cultures remember beginnings as restorations rather than creations. Why early texts emphasize inheritance over innovation. These themes are not demanded by theology alone. They recur too consistently, across too many independent traditions. The silence around these questions is not enforced by conspiracy. It is maintained by habit. Once a narrative is established, evidence is interpreted through it by default. Anomalies are absorbed or ignored, but rarely allowed to redefine the frame. This is not unique to archaeology. All knowledge systems exhibit inertia. Paradigms persist until pressure becomes unavoidable. The question is whether the pressure is already present, quietly accumulating beneath the surface of ancient records. Sumerian tablets do not argue with modern historians. Egyptian monuments do not protest their interpretation. They simply endure, offering the same data to every generation. What changes is the willingness to hear what that data might imply. If the ancient world truly remembered a prior collapse, then the reluctance to acknowledge it today becomes part of the pattern. Each civilization may inherit not only fragments of knowledge, but also mechanisms of forgetting. Amnesia becomes structural, reproduced unconsciously. In this sense, modern scholarship may be participating in the same cycle it seeks to describe, preserving forms, maintaining narratives, avoiding destabilizing questions. The tools are different, but the impulse is familiar. This does not mean that mainstream archaeology is wrong. It means that it may be incomplete. Its methods excel at reconstruction within continuity, but struggle at the edges where continuity breaks down. The deepest questions are not about what happened, but about what failed to survive. If a civilizational reset occurred, its most complete traces would not be physical. They would be conceptual, patterns of memory, shared anxieties, recurring structures of myth and ritual. These are harder to excavate, but no less real. As we move deeper into the ancient record, the silence grows louder. Not the silence of ignorance, but the silence of avoidance. The recognition that some questions, once fully entertained, cannot be easily set aside. Perhaps this is why the ancient texts feel unfinished. They gesture backward, then stop. They acknowledge loss without detailing it. They preserve consequences without explaining causes. They leave space where certainty should be. That space may not be accidental. It may be the last remaining trace of a world that collapsed so thoroughly that even its memory learned to be cautious. And as modern readers stand before that space, deciding how closely to examine it, we find ourselves repeating an ancient choice, whether to smooth over the gap or to sit quietly with the possibility that history as we know it has already been interrupted once before. As civilizations stabilize after disruption, memory becomes a resource to be managed. What is remembered confers authority. What is forgotten creates dependency. Over time, this dynamic shapes institutions whose power rests not only on control of land or labor, but on control of narrative. In the ancient world, religion and governance do not merely coexist. They merge into a single mechanism for regulating how the past is understood. In Sumer and Egypt, sacred authority is inseparable from historical continuity. Kings rule not by innovation, but by alignment with what already exists. Priests do not invent doctrine, they curate it. Their role is custodial, preserving inherited forms while shielding them from scrutiny. This arrangement is not accidental. When knowledge arrives from an earlier, partially forgotten world, it must be stabilized before it can be legitimized. Ritual becomes the primary interface between power and memory. By embedding history within repetitive action, institutions ensure that the past is reenacted rather than examined. Each performance reinforces the idea that order is timeless, not contingent. Questions about origin dissolve into obligation. One does not ask where the ritual came from, one performs it correctly. Over generations, this process produces a subtle shift. What was once remembered as inheritance becomes presented as eternity. The distinction matters. An inherited order implies a source and therefore the possibility of loss. An eternal order implies inevitability. For rulers seeking permanence, the second framing is far safer. Texts begin to reflect this reframing. Early records acknowledge descent, instruction, and restoration. Later ones emphasize divine mandate and unbroken continuity. The language evolves quietly, smoothing over earlier admissions of rupture. Floods become moral lessons rather than historical boundaries. Teachers become gods, loss becomes judgment. This transformation does not require deception. It arises naturally from the needs of governance. Stability depends on predictability. Predictability depends on shared belief. Shared belief depends on simplified narratives that do not invite destabilizing reflection. In this environment, history is not erased, it is filtered. Inconvenient complexities fade from emphasis. Ambiguous origins are left unexplored. What remains is a streamlined story that supports existing hierarchies. The past becomes a foundation rather than a question. Religious institutions play a crucial role in this filtering. By claiming access to sacred knowledge, they position themselves as intermediaries between humanity and an inaccessible past. Their authority rests not on discovery, but on preservation. To challenge the narrative is to challenge the institution itself. Over time, this dynamic hardens. Sacred texts become closed canons. Ritual forms are fixed. Interpretation narrows. Innovation is framed as heresy. The original flexibility that allowed knowledge to survive collapse is replaced by rigidity, designed to prevent further loss. This rigidity has consequences. When systems encounter new conditions, environmental shifts, social upheaval, technological change, they struggle to adapt. The same mechanisms that preserved continuity now resist evolution. Civilization becomes brittle. Yet from within the system, this brittleness is invisible. Stability is mistaken for strength. Longevity is taken as proof of correctness. The memory of earlier collapse recedes further into abstraction, no longer recognized as warning. In such a context, rewriting history does not require deliberate falsification. It occurs through emphasis and omission. What is celebrated is what reinforces authority. What is ambiguous is left untranslated. Over centuries, these choices accumulate, reshaping collective memory. This pattern repeats across empires. As power centralizes, narrative simplifies. Origins are clarified, not through evidence but through doctrine. The past becomes orderly, coherent, and safe. Its gaps are sealed with certainty. The irony is that this process often obscures the very knowledge it seeks to protect. By freezing interpretation, institutions prevent re-engagement with original meaning. Symbols become idols. Rituals become empty gestures. The system persists, but its internal coherence decays. Later observers inherit the result. Civilizations that appear confident in their origins, yet strangely incurious about them. Histories that begin abruptly. Myths that gesture backward without explanation. Traditions that insist on timelessness, while quietly betraying anxiety about loss. This institutional shaping of memory also affects how later cultures interpret earlier ones. When modern scholars encounter ancient records, they often receive them through layers of theological and imperial reframing. The earliest voices are muffled by centuries of interpretation. What may have begun as a pragmatic response to collapse, encode knowledge, restrict access, preserve form, evolves into a system of control. Memory becomes property. History becomes territory. This does not mean that ancient religions or empires conspired to erase the truth. It means they inherited a fragile legacy and responded in ways that prioritize survival over transparency. In doing so, they passed forward not only knowledge, but habits of forgetting. These habits persist. Each civilization builds its identity atop a curated past, smoothing its edges, reinforcing its legitimacy. Each inherits unresolved gaps and learns not to look too closely at them. If a previous world ended and its knowledge survived only in fragments, then controlling those fragments would have been essential. Power would gravitate toward those who could claim stewardship. Over time, stewardship becomes authority, and authority becomes orthodoxy. The deeper the past recedes, the harder it becomes to distinguish preservation from suppression. What is left unsaid becomes as important as what is proclaimed. Silence acquires structure. In this way, history is not only written by the victors, it is shaped by the survivors. Those who rebuild after collapse carry forward what they can, but they also carry fear. Fear of destabilization, fear of recurrence, fear of forgetting. That fear influences which questions are permitted and which are deferred indefinitely. Origins become sacred precisely because they are dangerous. To probe too deeply is to risk discovering that order is not eternal, that it was once taught, and that it could be lost again. As institutions solidify around this fear, they present stability as virtue and curiosity as threat. The past becomes a monument rather than a landscape, something to admire, not to explore, and so the story of civilization narrows. What remains is coherent, authoritative, and incomplete. The gaps persist, but they are framed as mysteries beyond reach, rather than as absences demanding attention. Within those gaps lies the possibility that history has been reshaped not only by natural catastrophe, but by deliberate forgetting. Forgetting born not of malice, but of necessity. As we approach the ancient record today, we inherit this layered silence. We are not merely reading texts. We are navigating the after-effects of decisions made under pressure long ago. Decisions about what to remember, what to ritualize, and what to leave unspoken. If the past was once reset, then the structures that followed were designed to prevent chaos, not to invite reconsideration. And in that design, history learned to guard itself, carefully, quietly, against the very questions that might one day seek to uncover what existed before the order we now call ancient. Every civilization leaves behind what it can afford to lose. What survives the centuries is not a neutral sample of the past, but the residue of decisions, what to store, what to copy, what to abandon when space, time, or stability runs out. In Sumer, this truth is pressed into clay itself. Thousands of tablets remain, yet they speak with a strangely selective voice, as if entire rooms of memory were sealed and never reopened. Libraries existed in the ancient world long before the idea of public knowledge. They were not places of curiosity, but of containment. Texts were gathered, ordered, and guarded because writing was powerful, fragile, and dangerous in equal measure. A tablet could stabilize law, fix ritual, or preserve lineage. It could also destabilize authority if misread or removed from context. What is striking is not how much survived, but how much clearly did not. References appear to texts no longer extant, to lists, instructions, and compositions that are cited but never quoted. The surviving tablets often feel like fragments torn from a larger archive, whose organizing logic has been lost. We see shelves without catalogues, conclusions without premises. Some tablets hint openly at this loss. They refer to older inscriptions, earlier records, and primordial writings whose origins are no longer accessible. The tone is not nostalgic, but resigned. The scribes acknowledge inheritance without expecting recovery. Knowledge has a history, but that history is already incomplete. This incompleteness is not random. Administrative texts survive in abundance because they were constantly recopied. Legal formulas persist because they were ritually essential. What fades are the explanatory layers, the commentaries, the debates, the contextual instructions that would have allowed later generations to understand why systems worked, not just how to perform them. The same pattern appears in Egypt. Sacred texts endure, but their interpretive frameworks thin over time. Temples preserve inscriptions whose meanings were already obscure to later priests. The physical archive remains, but its intellectual scaffolding collapses quietly. This suggests that loss was not simply the result of catastrophe or neglect. It was also the product of prioritization. When resources are limited, preservation becomes selective. What is immediately useful is saved. What requires extended study is deferred. Over generations, deferred knowledge disappears entirely. The act of copying itself shapes survival. Scribes do not reproduce everything. They choose what to transmit, often guided by tradition rather than comprehension. Errors accumulate. Simplifications creep in. Over time, the copy becomes authoritative, even if it no longer reflects the original. This process creates a paradox. The more a text is copied, the more stable it appears, yet the further it may drift from its source. Conversely, texts that require explanation to remain meaningful are less likely to be preserved. Complexity becomes a liability. If a previous world possessed a deeper or more integrated system of knowledge, its most sophisticated components would be the hardest to carry forward. They would depend on context, on long training, on continuity. When that continuity breaks, such knowledge collapses first. What remains is the skeleton of a system. Rules without rationale, rituals without origin stories, measurements without derivations. To later generations, these remnants appear complete because they function. Their incompleteness is invisible unless one knows what to look for. The loss of libraries is often imagined as a dramatic event. Fires, invasions, deliberate destruction. While such events certainly occurred, the deeper loss is quieter. It happens when texts are simply not recopied, when a generation no longer finds them useful enough to justify the effort. Silence replaces flame. This quiet loss may explain why so many ancient traditions emphasize secrecy. When knowledge becomes rare, it becomes protected. Access narrows. Initiation replaces education. The fewer who know, the easier it is to maintain continuity, but the harder it becomes to recover breadth. Over time, secrecy reshapes knowledge itself. It becomes compressed, stylized, and symbolic. Teaching shifts from explanation to demonstration. Meaning is implied rather than stated. The archive shrinks, but its authority grows. From the outside, such systems appear intentionally opaque, as if designed to exclude. From the inside, they may be experienced as acts of survival. When knowledge is fragile, transparency can be fatal. Modern readers often project intentional suppression onto this process, imagining lost libraries hidden or destroyed to control truth. While power certainly plays a role, this framing may miss the deeper dynamic. Much of what was lost simply could not be carried through repeated disruption. The ancient world faced constraints modern societies rarely consider. Writing materials were heavy, fragile, and expensive. Literacy was specialized. Political stability was intermittent. In such conditions, knowledge that did not directly support social order or ritual continuity struggled to survive. If we accept that civilization may have restarted after collapse, then early archives were likely built under pressure. Their purpose was not completeness, but stabilization. They aimed to preserve what was necessary to function, not what was necessary to understand everything. This distinction matters. Function can persist without comprehension. A calendar can be used without knowing how it was derived. A ritual can be performed without knowing why it works. Over time, such use becomes tradition, and tradition becomes authority. What disappears is the space for questioning, not because questioning is forbidden, but because the materials needed to support it no longer exist. Inquiry becomes speculative rather than grounded. Interpretation replaces analysis. As centuries pass, later cultures inherit these reduced archives and mistake them for beginnings. The earliest surviving texts are assumed to be the earliest that ever existed. Absence is misread as origin. This misreading is reinforced by the authority of survival. If something endured, it must have been important. If something vanished, it must have been trivial. Yet survival reflects circumstance as much as significance. The ancient libraries, then, do not merely represent what was known. They represent what could be saved. Their silences are as meaningful as their contents. When we search these records for traces of a deeper past, we encounter frustration not because evidence was never there, but because the chain of transmission broke too many times. Each break filtered memory further, until only durable fragments remained. These fragments hint at a larger structure, references to lost texts, allusions to prior knowledge, systems that work without explanation. Together, they suggest an archive beneath the archive, a body of understanding no longer accessible directly. The temptation is to imagine that this hidden archive still exists somewhere, waiting to be found intact. A buried library, a sealed chamber, a final revelation. Yet the more sobering possibility is that it no longer exists as a whole anywhere. What survives are traces distributed across cultures, encoded into rituals, symbols, and practices that no longer speak clearly to one another. Recovery, if possible at all, would not be a discovery but a reconstruction, fragile, partial, and uncertain. This realization reframes the ancient world's relationship with knowledge. They were not hoarders of secrets in the modern sense. They were survivors of loss, working with what remained, aware that much had already slipped beyond reach. Their libraries are not monuments to mastery but to triage. They show us what mattered most when continuity was threatened, and, by implication, what was sacrificed to preserve it. As we stand before these incomplete shelves of history, the question is no longer why so much is missing. It is how much must have existed for the absence itself to feel so heavy. At a certain point in the long aftermath of collapse, preservation alone is no longer enough. What survives must be governed. Knowledge that once flowed freely within a stable system becomes dangerous when stability is fragile. It can destabilize belief, undermine authority, or reopen questions that no longer have safe answers. In this environment, control does not arrive as censorship, but as structure. The ancient world does not hide this instinct, it formalizes it. Access to knowledge narrows, instruction becomes conditional. Texts are no longer merely records, they are instruments of initiation. To know is to belong, and to belong is to submit to an order that decides what may be known. This shift is visible in how knowledge is framed. What was once practical becomes sacred. What was once explained becomes pronounced. When explanation fades, assertion takes its place. The less a system is understood, the more confidently it must be declared. Priestly hierarchies embody this transition. Their authority does not depend on innovation or discovery, but on continuity of form. They guard rituals, calendars, symbols, and texts whose origins are already obscure. Their legitimacy rests on faithful transmission, not comprehension. To alter the form is to risk breaking something no one knows how to repair. This condition produces a paradox. The custodians of knowledge may not understand its foundations, yet they are responsible for its survival. Their task is not to question, but to maintain. In such a role, curiosity becomes liability. Stability depends on obedience to inherited structure. Over time, this obedience hardens into doctrine. Knowledge is no longer presented as something to be explored, but as something to be accepted. Questions are reframed as tests of faith or loyalty rather than inquiries. The boundary between ignorance and transgression blurs. This process does not require a central authority consciously rewriting history. It unfolds organically wherever continuity is threatened. When the cost of error is high, systems evolve to minimize deviation. Control becomes a form of risk management. The result is a layered past. On the surface lies the official narrative, coherent, authoritative, and stable. Beneath it lie older strata, hinted at but not explored. References to lost teachers, earlier ages, and prior orders persist, but they are framed as mysteries beyond reach rather than gaps inviting investigation. In such a system, knowledge that challenges the official narrative does not need to be destroyed. It only needs to be marginalized, labeled as dangerous, heretical, or irrelevant. Over generations, marginal knowledge withers from neglect. This marginalization shapes not only what is remembered, but how memory itself functions. The past becomes a source of legitimacy rather than inquiry. History is valued for its ability to stabilize the present, not to complicate it. The irony is that this very mechanism may preserve traces of what it seeks to contain. When knowledge is restricted, it often becomes encoded in indirect forms, symbols, allegories, and myths that can pass unnoticed. Control encourages camouflage. Thus, the deeper layers of memory retreat into ambiguity. They survive not as direct statements, but as patterns that repeat across cultures. The sense of an earlier order, the memory of instruction, the awareness of loss. These patterns persist precisely because they are not explicit enough to threaten authority. From a distance, this can resemble deliberate suppression, yet it may be more accurate to describe it as adaptive narrowing. After collapse, societies do not have the luxury of openness. They prioritize cohesion over completeness. Knowledge is shaped to fit what the system can safely contain. As centuries pass, this narrowing becomes normalized. Later generations inherit a past that feels complete because its gaps are institutionalized. What is missing is no longer noticed. The absence becomes invisible. When modern scholars approach these ancient systems, they often encounter resistance not in the form of hostility, but in the form of silence. Certain questions simply do not arise within the surviving frameworks. The sources do not speak to them directly. The trail ends quietly. This silence can be mistaken for evidence that nothing lies beyond it. Yet silence can also mark a boundary, a place where transmission failed, not because there was nothing to transmit, but because the system could not accommodate it. If a previous civilization possessed knowledge that challenged later structures of authority, its survival would be precarious. Such knowledge would need to be compressed, encoded, or allowed to fade. Its explicit form would be incompatible with the new order. This does not imply a single controlling force acting with intent. It suggests a pattern repeated wherever continuity is threatened. Control emerges not from conspiracy, but from necessity. Systems that survive are those that can regulate their own complexity. In this light, the loss of certain kinds of knowledge becomes understandable. Explanatory frameworks, theoretical models, and origin narratives are the hardest to preserve. They invite questioning. They demand context. They resist ritualization. Under pressure, they are the first to be abandoned. What remains are operational fragments. What works, what stabilizes, what can be repeated. Over time, these fragments acquire an aura of completeness. The system appears whole, even as its foundation erodes. The deeper danger of this process is not ignorance, but certainty. When a narrowed narrative becomes absolute, it forecloses the possibility of recovery. If the past is believed to be fully known, there is no reason to search for what was lost. Yet the ancient records themselves betray unease. They gesture toward missing teachers, vanished ages, broken continuity. They preserve the idea of loss even as they conceal its details. This suggests that forgetting was never total. The memory of loss persists as a shadow, felt rather than articulated. It appears as reverence for antiquity, suspicion of change, and anxiety about disorder. These cultural instincts may be the emotional residue of an earlier collapse, carried forward unconsciously. If so, then control of knowledge is not merely about power, it is about fear. Fear that too much remembering could destabilize what little stability remains. Fear that reopening the past could invite its return. In such a world, history becomes something to guard, not to explore. The safest knowledge is that which reinforces the present. The most dangerous questions are those that suggest the present is provisional. As we move deeper into the ancient record, the evidence does not point toward a single hidden truth waiting to be revealed. It points toward a long process of narrowing, knowledge shaped by survival, authority, and loss. What was once expansive becomes constrained. What was once explicit becomes symbolic. What was once understood becomes revered. And through this transformation, civilization continues, not as a straight line of progress, but as a careful negotiation with forgetting. If there is a lesson embedded in this pattern, it is not that history was deliberately erased, but that it was managed under pressure. The past was not rewritten so much as compressed until only what could safely endure remained. And in that compression, something essential slipped out of reach, not destroyed, not hidden, but made inaccessible by the very systems designed to ensure continuity. As we stand at the edge of this realization, the question is no longer who controlled ancient knowledge, but whether any civilization emerging from collapse can afford not to. As the fragments of ancient memory continue to surface and recede, a quieter question begins to form beneath them, one that is rarely stated directly. It is not about gods or disasters, teachers or lost libraries. It is about humanity's role within its own story. Were we the authors of civilization, or its recipients? And if we received it, what does that imply about responsibility, autonomy, and inheritance. The ancient texts do not portray early humans as inventors struggling upward from ignorance. They portray them as inheritors stepping into a world already structured. Order exists before people fully understand it. Laws precede legislation. Calendars precede explanation. Sacred spaces are aligned to patterns older than the hands that build them. Humanity arrives not at the beginning of knowledge, but in the middle of its transmission. This framing challenges a deeply comforting assumption that human intelligence alone, given time, naturally produces civilization. The ancient record does not deny human capability, but it complicates it. It suggests that knowledge may have been seeded, guided, or at least stabilized by forces outside the fragile span of ordinary human continuity. This does not require imagining beings hovering above humanity in mythic spectacle. It requires only acknowledging that learning can be inherited without being fully earned. Children learn languages they did not invent. Societies inherit systems they did not design. Over time, origin fades while function remains. If early civilizations inherited knowledge under such conditions, then humanity's earliest role was not mastery, but stewardship, to keep systems running, to maintain alignments, to perform rituals correctly. The emphasis on fidelity over creativity begins to make sense. When one does not know how a system was built, one does not experiment with its foundations. This stewardship carries a subtle psychological cost. To preserve without understanding is to live with dependency. Even when the original source is gone, its presence is felt in the rules that cannot be broken and the questions that cannot be asked. Authority becomes externalized, even when embodied in human institutions. Over generations, this dependency becomes normalized. People are born into systems they did not choose and are taught to treat them as natural. The idea that things could be otherwise becomes difficult to imagine. What began as inheritance hardens into inevitability. The ancient texts reflect this transition. Early references to instruction and descent gradually give way to assertions of divine order and eternal law. What was once acknowledged as received becomes presented as self-existing. This shift is not merely theological, it is psychological. It transforms responsibility into obedience. If humans were once guided, whether by longer-lived ancestors, advanced predecessors, or structured knowledge systems now lost, the withdrawal of that guidance would mark a profound turning point. Humanity would be left with the tools of civilization, but without the framework that produced them. The result would be a long period of imitation, adaptation, and gradual drift. This drift is visible in how later cultures reinterpret inherited systems. Calendars are adjusted without understanding their original calibration. Rituals are performed with increasing emphasis on symbolism rather than function. Laws are enforced without remembering the conditions they were designed to address. Civilization continues, but it becomes reactive rather than intentional. In such a context, the question of authorship becomes uncomfortable. To claim authorship is to claim understanding. To admit inheritance is to accept limitation. Many cultures resolve this tension by mythologizing the source of knowledge. Teachers become gods. Systems become sacred. The gap in understanding is filled with reverence. Yet reverence does not restore comprehension. It preserves form while sealing off inquiry. Over time, humanity forgets that it ever stood in a receiving role. Civilization becomes a human achievement again, but only because the memory of dependence has been erased. This erasure is not total. It survives as unease, as recurring myths of fallen ages, as anxiety about hubris and decline, as the persistent fear that order is fragile and can be lost. These themes echo across cultures not because they are invented, but because they reflect a lived inheritance of instability. If humanity is an inheritor rather than an originator, then progress takes on a different meaning. Advancement becomes less about discovery and more about recovery. Innovation becomes adaptation under constraint. The future is not a blank canvas, but a narrowing corridor shaped by what was lost. This perspective also reframes responsibility. If we did not design the systems we inhabit, then maintaining them is not enough. We must decide whether to rediscover their foundations or continue operating them blindly. Stewardship without understanding may preserve stability, but it cannot ensure resilience. The ancient world appears to have chosen preservation. Faced with the memory of collapse, it prioritized continuity over exploration. That choice may have been necessary at the time, but it carried forward a habit of deferral, a tendency to treat origins as dangerous and inquiry as destabilizing. Modern civilization inherits this habit, even as it prides itself on rational inquiry. We build atop systems whose origins we rarely question. We assume linear progress while quietly fearing regression. We celebrate innovation while relying on inherited frameworks we do not fully comprehend. If humanity has been guided before and left alone afterward, then our current moment carries a quiet weight. We are no longer apprentices, yet we may not be masters. We operate machinery built by histories we do not remember, governed by rules shaped by conditions that no longer exist. The ancient texts do not resolve this tension. They do not tell us whether humanity was meant to grow beyond stewardship or remain within it. They simply record that guidance ended, continuity fractured, and responsibility shifted. This shift may explain why so many ancient traditions frame the present age as diminished, not morally corrupted, but structurally constrained. Shorter lifespans, compressed time, fragmented knowledge, humanity survives but under tighter limits. If that framing reflects memory rather than myth, then the story of civilization is not one of ascent from ignorance to enlightenment. It is a story of inheritance under loss, of learning to function with partial understanding, of carrying forward tools without blueprints. And within that story lies an unresolved question that no ancient text answers directly. Was humanity meant to rediscover what was lost, or merely to maintain what remained? Were we always meant to be caretakers, or did we inherit a responsibility that exceeds our preparation? As the fragments continue to align and diverge, this question lingers without resolution. It does not accuse, it does not console, it simply waits, suspended between memory and possibility. If we are inheritors, then the past is not finished with us, and if we are more than inheritors, then the responsibility to move beyond stewardship, to understand rather than merely preserve, may be the most difficult inheritance of all. In the modern era, the ancient questions have not vanished. They have resurfaced quietly, reframed through new tools and disciplines that were never meant to interrogate myth, yet repeatedly stumble into it. Advances in archaeology, geology, astronomy, and genetics were designed to refine timelines, not disrupt them. And yet, again and again, they brush against irregularities that echo the old uncertainties preserved in clay and stone. Radiocarbon dates refuse to align neatly with established chronologies. Geological evidence suggests abrupt climate shifts where gradual change was expected. Astronomical calculations confirm that ancient alignments were not approximate, but precise, sometimes uncomfortably so. These findings do not overthrow history outright, but they introduce pressure points where certainty thins. Consider how often discoveries are described as unexpected, anomalous, or ahead of their time. These phrases appear frequently in academic literature, functioning as linguistic cushions. They acknowledge disruption while containing it. An artifact does not rewrite history, it merely challenges assumptions. The implication is subtle, but consistent. The framework remains intact, even as its edges fray. Yet the accumulation of such anomalies tells a different story. Precision where none should exist. Planning where improvisation is assumed. Continuity where fragmentation is expected. These patterns mirror the ancient claims of inheritance and loss more closely than modern narratives often admit. Even the study of human evolution introduces quiet complications. Genetic bottlenecks suggest periods when humanity nearly vanished, compressing diversity into a narrow survival line. Such events align eerily well with ancient memories of resets, times when continuity was threatened, and what followed was a diminished but persistent lineage. These scientific findings do not confirm ancient myths in a literal sense. They do something more unsettling. They refuse to dismiss them entirely. They suggest that beneath symbolic language may lie compressed records of real disruptions, filtered through cultural memory rather than measurement. Astronomy offers another point of contact. When ancient calendars are back-calculated, their accuracy often holds across vast spans of time. This implies long-term observation, careful calibration, and institutional memory. These requirements clash with the idea of sudden invention by newly settled societies. The sky does not forgive mistakes easily. To align with it, one must already know how it moves. Geology, too, speaks softly but insistently. Evidence of massive flooding events, rapid sea level rise, and regional devastation appears in layers once thought stable. These events do not need to be global to be transformative. A flood does not have to cover the world to end a civilization. It only has to erase the places where memory was stored. Modern technology has also changed how we read ancient texts. Digital reconstruction allows fragmented tablets to be reassembled. Comparative analysis across cultures is easier than ever. Patterns that once seemed coincidental now appear structural. Similar sequences recur: instruction, stability, catastrophe, inheritance, decline. These recurrences do not prove a single lost civilization. They suggest something less dramatic and more difficult to dismiss. That human history may be punctuated by discontinuities more severe than previously acknowledged. That what we call ancient may already be a recovery phase. What makes this realization uncomfortable is not its strangeness, but its familiarity. The ancient record has been hinting at this all along. The modern tools simply sharpen the outline. Science does not replace myth here, it intersects with it. Yet resistance remains strong. Each anomaly is explained individually. A flood becomes local. A calendar becomes ceremonial. A precision alignment becomes coincidence. These explanations are not wrong, but they are incomplete. They prevent synthesis. They keep the larger question at bay. The larger question is not whether ancient people were more advanced than we assume. It is whether advancement itself is the wrong metric. Knowledge can be deep without being technological. Stability can exist without machinery. Memory can persist without writing, until it suddenly cannot. If ancient societies inherited systems they did not fully understand, then modern rediscovery is inherently limited. We are reconstructing outcomes without access to processes. We see the artifacts of knowledge without its ecology. This limitation may explain why modern discoveries feel simultaneously revelatory and frustrating. We glimpse sophistication, but not its origin. We recognize intention, but not authorship. The pieces fit together, but the picture remains incomplete. There is also a psychological resistance at play. To accept that civilization has restarted before is to accept vulnerability. It challenges the assumption that progress is cumulative and irreversible. It introduces the possibility that knowledge can be lost faster than it is gained. The ancient warnings about decline, hubris, and forgetting take on new weight in this context. They are no longer moral tales alone. They become reflections of lived experience. People who had seen continuity break would encode caution into every system that followed. Modern society, armed with unprecedented data and reach, may feel insulated from such collapse. Yet the ancient record suggests that complexity itself can be a liability. Systems grow interdependent. Memory becomes externalized. Resilience gives way to efficiency. The parallels are uncomfortable. We store knowledge in forms that require constant maintenance. We assume continuity. We rarely plan for total reset. In this, we resemble the civilizations that followed the ancient ruptures more than those that preceded them. If the watchers, teachers, or long-lived stewards of the past were metaphors for stability itself, long durations of uninterrupted memory, then their disappearance marks the beginning of our condition. Shorter horizons, fragmented knowledge, repeated reinvention. Modern science, for all its power, operates within these same constraints. It excels at accumulation, but struggles with loss. It reconstructs, but cannot recover what left no trace. As discoveries continue to surface, the pressure will increase, not toward a single revelation, but toward a re-evaluation of assumptions. History may need to be seen not as a ladder, but as a shoreline, periodically submerged, periodically revealed. The ancient texts did not predict our tools, but they anticipated our confusion. They warned that understanding would thin, that symbols would outlast explanations, that the past would feel both close and unreachable. In listening to these warnings through modern instruments, we are not uncovering secrets hidden deliberately from us. We are encountering the limits of recovery itself, the realization that some losses are structural, not conspiratorial. What remains, then, is not certainty, but responsibility. To recognize patterns without forcing conclusions, to accept ambiguity without dismissing it, to acknowledge that history may not be finished revealing its fractures. As modern evidence presses gently against ancient memory, the question shifts again. Not toward what exactly was lost, but toward how many times loss has already shaped who we are. If civilization has been reset before, and if its traces reach us only in fragments, then every discovery is less a revelation than a reminder that continuity is fragile, that memory requires care, and that the silence in the record may be as instructive as its words. Standing at this intersection of ancient whisper and modern measurement, we are left with a sensation rather than an answer. That history is deeper than its timelines, and that beneath our confidence lies a quiet inheritance of interruption, still unfolding, still unresolved. If the watchers did not vanish entirely, then absence itself becomes misleading. What appears as disappearance may instead be withdrawal, dispersal, or transformation, an exit from visibility rather than existence. Ancient texts are careful in their phrasing. They do not describe annihilation. They describe removal, sealing, distancing. The implication is subtle. The presence changed, not necessarily the reality behind it. In Sumerian memory, the teachers depart after the flood, their role concluded or curtailed. In later traditions, watchers are bound, sent away, or confined to inaccessible realms. These are not narratives of extinction. They are narratives of separation. A boundary is established where none existed before. This boundary reshapes the human world profoundly. Guidance becomes indirect. Instruction gives way to interpretation. Humanity is no longer corrected in real time. It must infer. The difference between these modes is immense. One produces continuity. The other produces divergence. If the Watchers were embodiments of long-duration stability, whether actual beings, institutions, or inherited knowledge systems, their withdrawal would explain the acceleration of change that follows. Without extended oversight, systems drift, meanings fragment, errors accumulate faster than they can be corrected. The ancient record hints that this withdrawal was not entirely voluntary. It is often framed as consequence rather than choice. Something about the post-flood world makes sustained guidance impossible. The environment changes, time compresses, lifespans shorten. The conditions that once allowed for deep continuity no longer hold. In this sense, the Watchers may not have gone anywhere. They may have become incompatible with the new world. What once functioned cannot adapt to altered constraints. Withdrawal becomes the only option. This interpretation reframes later myths of fallen angels, exiled gods, or hidden teachers. These are not moral tales about rebellion alone. They are symbolic accounts of a system that could no longer operate openly. The separation is structural. Once guidance retreats, memory becomes the primary link to the past. But memory without reinforcement decays. It becomes ritualized, mythologized, and eventually aestheticized. The Watchers live on not as presences but as echoes, names, symbols, warnings embedded in story. Some traditions suggest that fragments of this guidance persist in hidden forms, sacred lineages, esoteric schools, restricted knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next. These ideas are often dismissed as fantasy, yet they reflect a reasonable response to loss. When continuity breaks, preservation becomes selective. Selective preservation creates distortion. Knowledge becomes asymmetric. Some know fragments, most know none. Over time, even those fragments lose context. What remains is the belief that something is being guarded, even if no one remembers exactly what. This belief itself shapes culture. It produces reverence for antiquity, suspicion of novelty, and the sense that wisdom lies behind rather than ahead. It also produces anxiety, an intuition that humanity is living below its potential, constrained by forgotten limits. If the Watchers represent a mode of existence aligned with longer temporal horizons, then their absence explains the modern condition precisely. Short-term thinking dominates. Systems are optimized for efficiency rather than resilience. Knowledge is abundant but shallow, accumulating faster than it can be integrated. Ancient myths warn repeatedly about this condition. They do not condemn progress. They warn about forgetting. They describe ages shrinking, lifespans shortening, memory thinning. The disappearance of the Watchers marks the point where humanity becomes responsible for itself without the tools it once relied on. Responsibility without understanding produces imitation. Humanity copies forms it inherited without fully grasping their purpose. Architecture repeats alignments long after their astronomical meaning fades. Laws persist after their social context dissolves. Rituals continue after their function is forgotten. In such a world, the Watchers do not need to return to influence events. Their absence is already doing the work. The gap they leave defines the trajectory of civilization more strongly than their presence ever could. Some texts hint that the Watchers observe rather than intervene. This observation is not surveillance, it is distance. The teacher watches the student struggle, knowing that intervention would prevent learning, yet aware that learning under these conditions is slow and costly. Whether taken literally or metaphorically, this image carries weight. Humanity is left to navigate complexity with inherited tools and incomplete maps. Mistakes are no longer corrected externally. Consequences must teach what instruction once did. This may explain why ancient traditions emphasize judgment not as punishment, but as accounting. Actions have weight. Balance must be restored. Without guidance, the world self-corrects harshly. Floods, collapses, resets. These become the language of feedback. If the Watchers once mediated between humanity and such forces, their withdrawal exposes humanity directly to consequence. Civilization becomes experimental, learning through failure rather than instruction. The lingering presence of the Watchers in myth may serve a different purpose, not to promise return, but to remind humanity of what it no longer has, to keep alive the memory of guidance, even if guidance itself is gone. This memory functions as both comfort and warning. Comfort because it suggests that order once existed and therefore could exist again. Warning because it implies that such order is fragile and contingent. In some traditions, the Watchers are said to return at the end of an age. In others, they never return. The ambiguity matters. It shifts focus away from expectation and toward responsibility. If return is uncertain, then waiting becomes dangerous. Perhaps the question was never where the Watchers went, but what their departure demands of those left behind. A civilization without teachers must either rediscover foundations or continue improvising atop erosion. Rediscovery requires humility. It requires admitting that inheritance is incomplete and that progress may involve looking backward as much as forward. Improvisation, by contrast, favors speed, efficiency, and confidence, traits that thrive briefly and fail abruptly. The ancient record does not tell us which path humanity chose definitively. It records cycles of both, periods of reverence and recovery followed by periods of hubris and collapse. The Watchers remain absent throughout. If they exist now, they exist as memory, as pressure, as the sense that something essential is missing. They exist in the unease that accompanies technological power without corresponding wisdom. They exist in the recurring fear that civilization is outrunning its understanding. In this sense, the Watchers never left. They became the negative space around which history organizes itself. Their absence is the shape of our condition. As humanity advances deeper into complexity, the ancient question quietly returns, not as myth, but as tension. Are we meant to rebuild what was lost, or to learn to live without it? Is guidance something to be recovered, or something to be replaced with responsibility? The texts offer no answer. They only preserve the moment of separation and its consequences. They leave us with a silence that feels deliberate, as if the next step was never meant to be instructed. If the Watchers withdrew because the world changed, then the burden now rests entirely with those who remain. And if that is so, then the most unsettling possibility is not that the Watchers might return, but that they already did what they were meant to do, and that what follows was always meant to be faced alone. When the long arc of this story is allowed to settle, what remains is not a revelation but a pattern. Civilizations do not simply rise, they remember, forget, and remember again. Knowledge does not vanish all at once. It thins, fragments, and reappears wearing different names. What feels like an ending is often a narrowing, and what feels like a beginning is often a return without context. The ancient record from Sumer onward does not describe a single fall or a single recovery. It gestures toward repetition. Ages compress, lifespans shorten. Systems that once required patience adapt to urgency. Civilization survives, but it does so under constraints that feel inherited rather than chosen. This repetition is easy to miss because it does not announce itself dramatically. It hides in the margins, in the way early texts speak of restoration rather than creation, in the way myths across cultures describe earlier worlds as more stable, more ordered, more continuous. These are not fantasies of golden ages born from nostalgia alone. They are structural memories shaped by the experience of loss. What changes most profoundly after each reset is not technology, but relationship to time. Long horizons collapse into short ones. Decisions that once unfolded across centuries are forced into years, then decades. Knowledge that required continuity becomes unsustainable. Civilization learns to move faster, not wiser. In this acceleration, meaning becomes fragile. Symbols multiply to compensate. Rituals stand in for understanding. Authority replaces explanation. The system functions, but it becomes increasingly opaque even to those who maintain it. This opacity creates the illusion of permanence. When origins are forgotten, structures appear eternal. When resets are unremembered, continuity feels guaranteed. Yet the ancient texts never fully relinquish their caution. They whisper reminders of floods, of withdrawn guidance, of orders that failed once and could fail again. Modern civilization, for all its sophistication, shares this condition. Our knowledge is vast but distributed. Our memory is externalized. Our systems are efficient but interdependent. We assume continuity while quietly fearing collapse. We plan for growth, rarely for reset. This fear surfaces indirectly, in stories of apocalypse, in anxieties about decline, in the persistent sense that something essential is being lost faster than it can be replaced. These are not new concerns. They echo the ancient unease preserved in clay and stone. If history is a loop rather than a line, then the present moment occupies a familiar position. A phase of expansion following recovery. A period of confidence built atop inherited systems whose origins are obscured. A narrowing gap between complexity and resilience. The ancient world did not leave us instructions for escaping this cycle. It left us records of having lived through it. Their warnings are not prescriptive. They are descriptive. They do not tell us what to do. They show us what happens. One recurring lesson is that survival favors compression. What endures through disruption is what can be simplified, repeated, and protected. This is why symbols outlast explanations, and why rituals survive long after their rationale fades. Memory adapts by shedding depth. Another lesson is more unsettling. Each reset leaves humanity more capable in some ways, and more constrained in others. Tools improve, understanding narrows, power grows, wisdom fragments, the balance shifts, but it does not necessarily advance. The idea of a final age, an ultimate culmination of history, does not appear prominently in the earliest records. Instead, there is an expectation of recurrence. Endings are followed by restorations. Loss is followed by partial recovery. The cycle continues, unevenly. If the watchers, teachers, or stewards of ancient memory were symbols of long continuity, their absence defines the human condition as we know it. We operate without extended guidance. We learn through consequence. We build, test, and rebuild. This autonomy is both liberation and burden. Without teachers, humanity is free to innovate. Without foundations, innovation risks repeating old mistakes under new names. Progress becomes ambiguous, capable of greatness and collapse in equal measure. The ancient texts seem aware of this ambiguity. They do not celebrate autonomy uncritically. They frame it as responsibility. Once guidance ends, accountability begins. The world no longer corrects gently, it responds. Floods, collapses, and resets are not portrayed as punishments in their earliest forms. They are portrayed as inevitabilities, responses to imbalance, accumulation, and forgetting. The system corrects itself when correction is no longer possible internally. In this light, the final warning of ancient history is not apocalyptic. It is cyclical. It suggests that forgetting is as powerful a force as knowledge, and that civilizations fall not when they lack intelligence, but when they lose awareness of fragility. The most dangerous moment is not ignorance, but certainty. When a civilization believes it has escaped history, it stops listening to it. When it assumes permanence, it stops preparing for loss. When it treats the past as settled, it becomes vulnerable to repetition. The story of the Watchers before Egypt is not a claim about hidden beings waiting to return. It is a meditation on memory, on what happens when continuity breaks and guidance withdraws. It asks whether humanity can move beyond stewardship into understanding, or whether each age must relearn its limits through collapse. No ancient text answers this question. They end in silence, not resolution. They leave us with images rather than conclusions, submerged cities, sealed tablets, withdrawn teachers, cycles marked but not explained. Perhaps that silence is intentional, a recognition that some knowledge cannot be handed down safely, only rediscovered, a recognition that responsibility cannot be taught without being lived. If civilization has been reset before, then the future is not guaranteed by progress alone. It depends on memory, on whether we can recognize patterns without mythologizing them, and whether we can hold complexity without losing resilience. The ancient world does not ask us to believe in a lost golden age. It asks us to notice repetition, to see history not as a ladder, but as a tide, advancing, retreating, reshaping the shoreline each time it returns. As this journey comes to rest, there is no final revelation waiting beyond the horizon, only a question that has survived every reset intact. If we are living inside another cycle, more advanced, more connected, yet no less fragile, then what will remain of us when compression becomes necessary again? What will be simplified, ritualized, and sealed for survival? And what, quietly, will be lost beyond recovery? History does not answer. It only listens. And in that listening, it waits to see whether this age will recognize itself in the echoes it has inherited, or whether it too will become another fragment, pressed into silence, remembered only as the world that once thought the cycle had ended.